So I recently watched Bob Eger's Nosferatu, and I wanted to do a deep dive into my thoughts around the film, and my thoughts maybe on the state of modern horror in general. So first and foremost, I have to say that it's a stunning achievement and one of the best pieces of horror I've seen in I really don't know how long. It's so refreshing to see a resurgence in filmmaking that's designed not only to be effective and realistic, but in this case especially also beautiful. And I know that beautiful is kind of a strange word to describe a horror film, but this isn't a horror film like you've seen since maybe like the old days of proper gothic horror. So one of the things that made this film so effective when compared to its modern contemporaries is the seriousness with which it takes itself. Nosferatu is in many ways the vampire movie, but in some ways it more closely resembles what might be referred to as a classic possession film, and this makes Nosferatu's triumph all the more delicious, as these two genres of horror have been, as of late, sucked dry and left to rot, if you will. It's ironic, then, that it's Count Orlok himself, in some ways could be seen as the godfather of the subgenre, who breathed new life into this bag of bones. And this might be why, but it's impossible to take Orlok in any way other than seriously. And that's quite often what causes a horror movie to fail, is it fails when the audience can't take the threat seriously. Horror is escapism at its core, and it gives the voyeur a break from the mundane, and it throws them into this fantastical world where the stakes are as high as they can possibly be raised. And mankind weren't built for this world that we currently inhabit, where external threats from the natural world are subdued, and the threat from the fellow man is clouded by external forces in place to shield us from base reality. We evolved to fight monsters and to fear dark places. And now that monsters are gone and locked behind zoo bars and Disney fantasies about what lions and stuff really are, and the dark places are awash with electric lights that blot out the stars, we find ourselves safe, in a bodily sense. And it's then our minds that create the horror that we maybe didn't know we were craving. And it seemed to me while I was watching that this is the case for the characters themselves, the mind creating the horror, and therefore, as an extension for us, the audience. It's set in 19th century Germany. The characters find themselves in an increasingly scientific and sophisticated society with little to no room for the fantastical, which makes them easy prey for a force that they no longer believe in. Throughout the movie, the vampire's hardly ever seen. Instead, he's obscured in shadow. In fact, the filmmaker seemingly went out of his way to describe Count Orlok as the Shadow, even more often than he's referred to as a vampire. And this brought to mind the Jungian concept of the Shadow, and as the movie progressed, Willem Dafoe's character was introduced as this Swiss psychologist named Professor Von Franz, of all things, who had been discredited in the academic field because of his obscure theories and his interest in the occult scientists and the alchemy and all sorts of odd things. And he's brought in to help this girl who's suffering from an apparent psychological attack by a shadow that seemingly is coming from within her, and it stems back to a blurry yet clearly traumatic childhood experience, and his advice to her is to confront this shadow head on. Anyway, if Robert Eggers wasn't trying to invoke Jung, this is all one heck of a coincidence. So in reflecting on the movie, I was compelled to think about it through the lens of, I thought dream interpretation might be an interesting lens. And I wanted to see what kind of symbols and archetypes that were laid out for us for this in this classic tale, and what they were trying to invoke. So this isn't an exhaustive interpretation, and I'd love to see more discourse on this subject. This is just what I noticed in my viewing so far, and also fair warning for spoilers ahead. So, if I were to summarize the plot, as I would a dream report, it would likely go something like this. There's a newlywed couple, and their love seems quite passionate, but they don't seem to know one another, each having idealized the other in some kind of a way. Hutter, the husband, thinks of her, his wife, as as sort of a trad wife, a traditional wife, to be taken care of, brought flowers, and who would want him to succeed monetarily and get her a bigger house and servants. She's the driving force behind his desire for a big opportunity at work. He has maybe a vague knowledge that in her past she's suffered from a non-specific psychosis, though he's convinced himself that this is all in the past and better not spoken of or acknowledged at all. Ellen, the wife, thinks of him as a savior of some kind. When she met him, she felt her melancholy fade away, and the darkness of the shadow lifted. She cannot stand for him to leave her alone, and would rather be with him all the time, even if it means he loses these opportunities at work. She's hurt when he brings her flowers, because she thinks of this as them being killed. When Hutter is summoned away to meet with the Count, he leaves Ellen in the care of his very modern-minded friend. In his absence, Ellen's condition quickly deteriorates back to her pre-married state. Her psychosis is revealed to be a kind of psychic connection with Count Orlok himself, and it's revealed that her loneliness as a child caused her to reach out through some nondescript spiritual practices, and that he's possessed her for her entire life. There's also somewhat of an implied sexual tension here as well. When Hutter enters her life, she thinks she's free of Count Orlok, but now that the Count has lured Hutter away from her, in her loneliness, Orlok returns. As the story progresses, it's revealed that Orlok desires to have Ellen to himself, even tricking Hutter into selling her to him for the proverbial sack of gold. When he first presents himself in the flesh to Ellen, she rejects him, because this is what she believes she wants. It's clear from her body language, however, that this manifestation of her shadow is everything that she wishes Hutter to be. Someone who recognizes her uniqueness and her spiritual gifts, but perhaps even more importantly, someone who desires closeness to her, and someone who will not leave her alone. So much so that he literally wants to eat her. Count Orlok in this way is the manifestation of Ellen's animus, pushed so deeply into her shadow that one could look at him as coming out the other side. So what do I mean by this? The shadow is part of ourselves, and it's the part of ourselves that we keep hidden, even from ourselves. If confronted with the shadow, it must be denied because it's not acceptable to us or to the society in which we live. In this way, one could even look at the mass of people living public and private lives and think of the private life itself as society's shadow. The things that we do behind closed doors and that we would never acknowledge in polite society are indeed society's shadow. Ellen's psychosis is actively hidden from the world by Hutter and his friends. Hutter himself all but forbade her from even mentioning the foreboding feelings. Is it not right and proper, then, that the unacceptable animus that Ellen has been repressing into the shadow all of her life would then come out on the other end and appear into society itself, both as Orlok himself and as a wave of plague that cuts through the society in his wake? After all, Ellen's secret is the result of society and therefore part of society's shadow as well. As Ellen is attacked by her shadow, so then is society, as above, so below, as within, so without. Orlok is entouraged by an army of plague rats that infect the entire city with a horrible and deadly illness. It's worth noting as well that rats are creatures that live in the underworld. Their emergence into the human realm is a sign in and of itself that the line between conscious and unconscious has been blurred. It's this blurring that allows Orlok to leave the shadow and enter into reality. This is at the heart of what I believe made this movie so compelling. The monster is not some unthinking beast like a typical monster movie or a slasher, nor is it purely a malevolent force like a demon from a cheap possession flick. He's the manifestation of something repressed in all of us. Not him exactly, for he's a monster created in Ellen's shadow. But none of us should be so naive as to think we do not carry a monster or two, tucked away in our own personal shadows, just waiting to be released. The conclusion of this film subverts the traditional story. Not in a cringe-inducing modern tradition, of like turning tropes on their head, but in a way far more loyal to the deep archetypical story than most filmmakers and storytellers have dared to venture. The expected ending to a possession story is that the spiritualist or medium, in this case Professor Von Franz, will have a trick or two up their sleeve. Even if the first or second attempt at exorcism does not work, there's usually a plot device for them to use that allows the possessed heroine to be redeemed. Sometimes this is even underlined for seriousness by the death of the medium themselves in the attempt. And then there's the expected subversion of the trope, where the evil is thought to have been defeated, only to be revealed in the final frame as not have been defeated and still here all along. But Nosferatu is not here to give us the satisfaction of the ending that we think we want. Instead, it's here to give us the story that is true to itself, up to the very end. Instead of exorcising the demon from our poor and helpless innocent girl, Professor Von Franz talks with her and finds out that the shadow has been with her since childhood. Instead of advising her to ignore or deny the figure like the rest of society around her, his advice is for her to confront him. To bring him out of the shadow and into light is the only way to defeat him. For the rest of his task, Von Franz gets the rest of the meddlesome men out of the way so that Ellen can do what must be done. She does not deny the animus. She comes into communion with it. They enter into a sexual embrace and her blood is drained through the night and into morning. The monster is brought out of the shadow and into the daylight through her voluntary sacrifice and dies in her arms just as she dies in his. Hutter and the others enter the room just moments later and find them both dead in a Beauty and the Beast tableau. Only in this story, 'twas Beast who killed the Beauty, just as Beauty killed the Beast. Count Orlok does not burst into flames in the sunshine, nor is he reduced to ash or simply disappear. He is reduced to a harmless and withered corpse. A sad and pathetic bag of bones laying prone is the final image that the film closes upon. This is to say, that which we force into the shadow will become monstrous, but those monsters are only as dangerous as our fear of them. The proper response to fear is exposure, not protection. And for those who would mourn the passing of Ellen, remember that this story, like all dreams, can be viewed through the symbolic, or in this case even the alchemical lens. To the alchemist, something must be given up in order for something to be gained. Often the thing you least want to sacrifice is what will be demanded. But in this case, what you least wanted to do, well, that's the very thing you must do. The goal of the work is to die to your old self in order that you might be born again. For Ellen to die in this confrontation with the shadow is in this case a triumph of her true self over the ego. She died to the world that would oppress her true nature and place her in ever more constricting corsets until she could not even imagine an ideal that was not by nature devouring. As Professor Von Franz said to her, in another life, perhaps she would have been a great priestess with her spiritual power. And in this way, she is free.